Hi, welcome to Cloud Cover. My name is Ryan Dunn.
And I'm Steve Marks.
Well, this week we're back from PDC. We have another show and a ton of things to cover. I don't know that we can actually get to all of them on this show, but we're going to make our best to get, over the course of a few episodes, a lot of the top features that we announced at PDC and also dig into the details of really how these works. Now, there's sessions, there's topics, there's keynotes, there's just so much to cover. But for this show, we're going to focus in on one area in particular, and that's around the Windows Azure startup tasks. So those are those tasks that we use to bootstrap the role. That will be our feature this week. But before we get to that, as always, let's round up the news.
And we have a ton of news. We decided that we would just pick off sort of a couple of the highlights from the various announcements around the Windows Azure platform from PDC. So we've got just a couple highlights, and we'll go kind of quickly through them, but there is a lot of stuff to catch up on. On the Windows Azure blog, you spoke, we listened, and responded.
It's a dramatic pause.
I can't help it, but yeah, there's a dramatic pause between listened and responded. That's not good grammar, people. I'm just going to give a little lesson.
And responded.
If you put a comma and then and, that means it's a compound sentence. That means it's like, instead of saying, I'm Ryan Dunn, period, I'm Steve Marks, you say, I'm Ryan Dunn, comma, and I'm Steve Marks. That doesn't really work well because the same person can't say both. But anyway, if you just put a comma here between the two different verbs, but there's no new subject, it doesn't work. There should be no comma here. It should just say, we listened and responded. That is Steve's grammar lesson of the week.
Send check or money order to the address on your screen.
This is a new segment on the show. Every week I'm going to make fun of grammar in like our own blog posts. Basically this is sort of the summary of all the stuff that happened in Windows Azure itself. So we're going to cover some of the SQL Azure stuff and the App Fabric stuff. But in Windows Azure, we've got the VM role. I guess we should scroll down to see sort of the rest of these.
Wait, let me try it.
No, you can't.
Ready?
You can't do that right. No, it's not a touch screen. There's no way that's going to work. Okay. Whoa. How are you doing that? Okay. Anyway, there's a VM role support here. There's elevated privileges, which actually we're going to touch on a little bit as we talk about startup tasks. Full IS. Hosted web core, you can still use it actually if you really want to, but you can get the full power of IS, install modules, whatever you want to do. Remote desktop.
There's a new portal.
There's a new portal. Where is that in this thing?
They probably forgot. I mean, there's so many things to cover.
There's some stuff down here. I'm sure there's.
Did they get to Windows Azure Connect? I mean,
I'm sure somewhere. Well, that was what I was about to say, because that is in this list here. There's Windows Azure Connect, which used to be called Project Sydney. That's the IP connectivity cross premises. So let me put my machines in my data center and the machines in the cloud on the same network. There's an extra small Windows Azure instance, so you can start off with even more inexpensive. You're not supposed to say cheaper, so I didn't pretend you didn't hear me say cheaper. There's a more inexpensive version of
a lesser expensive or more.
Yeah, but less expensive. That sounds bad too. I don't know. Anyway, it's 5 cents an hour. For the extra small thing,
which is less than half.
That is less than half of what our smallest previous instance size was in terms of price. There's the new portal. See, there is a new portal.
There it is.
There's some interesting kind of changes in diagnostics. We're going to have to cover that sort of as a topic.
There's so many things in here. I think people are just going to have to read this post. We could spend the entire show.
I'm not even going to talk about the stuff that's coming next year. I'm going to just stop right there. Let's stop there.
But the meta point here is we heard what you guys had to say about what we needed to deliver, and it was something like 80% of the top features were delivered at this PDC. That's huge.
You mean from Migrate Windows Azure idea.com?
Like 80%, and like on the top of the top features, almost everything was checkbox. I think as soon as we get secondary indices, Roger Jennings, we will then we'll have chalked off the top ones.
The whole first page. There's a little link down here, but you guys probably know this URL, but MicrosoftPDC.com now has not live anymore, now has recorded streams of all the sessions, all the pre-recorded sessions, all the sessions that were presented live, all the Channel 9 live stuff, which we'll talk about as we close out the news. We did a segment on there. So if you want to watch, if you want to learn any of this stuff, you can kind of go there. There's also a post on the Windows Azure blog that I decided we weren't going to put in the news segment, but now I'm doing it anyway. That's got this list that basically has the Windows to Azure related talks,
Right.
links to the video so that you can actually watch
and
it.
then everything should be listed now as on demand, which means you can go out and you can select it in your player and go ahead and watch the stream. If there's a few stragglers by the time this records, those will get picked up early next week or later this week sometime. So,
Great. Okay.
all right.
Let's move on. Oh, all right. Never mind. This is that blog post that I just showed. We're really well coordinated for this one.
I'm gonna go with you on the on what you were gonna show.
Okay, fine enough. Fair enough. Okay.
PDC.
SQL Azure PDC 2010 announcements. So the SQL Azure team also has a bunch of announcements. Reporting is probably one of the big ones. The CTP for SQL Azure reporting is coming.
Yeah, that's exciting too. We showed that in the keynote demo. The Rafiki
Project Rafiki
demo had some SQL Azure reporting. I know there was a session, and there's probably an on-demand talk on that as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of demand for reporting services. Good to hear that we have CTP coming or shortly available by the time you see this.
Yep. SQL Azure Data Sync CTP2. This is another CTP, but of SQL Azure Data Sync. So that's got some
that should
cool
actually
sort of improvements.
Yeah, I think that adds the capability to sync local SQL server to the cloud.
Yep.
That's the big one in there. So
SQL Server and SQL Azure, and even SQL Azure databases across data centers as well as with on-premise SQL Server.
So those are the big changes. Pretty big update there.
And Database Manager for SQL Azure, which I don't
was formerly Project Houston.
What Project Houston is now called.
So Project Houston is now Database Manager for SQL Azure.
Yep. So that's
the
great.
Silverlight. That's the Silverlight front end.
Silverlighty.
Yeah.
And so there's a link here to go kind of sign up to get information about this stuff and get access to it. So that's coming.
Right.
So do sign up if you care about those things and want to see them. Windows Azure App Fabric caching.
That was one of the big announcements. A lot of people were pretty excited about this. The caching
as a service.
It's actually caching as a service. That's right. So you essentially subscribe, and with little to no change to your application, it's some providers that you essentially pop into your web config. You're able to take advantage of caching without setting up servers, without deploying anything, nothing. It's caching as a service. Now, right now, it's in CTP, so there are some limitations to it. The size of the cache is somewhat limited and other things. But once this is fully rolled out, you'd expect the options on how much granularity you want, or how big of a cache you want, or how isolated you want it to be will be opened up as well further.
Yep, and people can go and do this today, right? If they go to portal.appfabriclabs.com, you can just go get started and set this up for free because this is CTP. So now is your chance to sort of kick the tires and play with it a little bit now. But it's not the final production stuff, so don't draw too many conclusions, I guess, from it. I mean, I wouldn't go do my perf test now, for example, and stuff, because this is still early stuff and it's not all.
We will actually publish here by the time you see this video. If everything goes well, we'll have another version of the Windows Azure Training Kit available, and there will be hands-on labs that show exactly how to exploit the caching service.
Great.
All right.
Okay, so we haven't done a show in a couple weeks, but that's not entirely true because we did do a live show.
That is correct.
Just last week at PDC, and so we've got. You can go find that. If you go to MicrosoftPDC.com, it'll sort of bounce you straight to here, and then you can go dig in. Just go to the guide, and we're in there.
Yep.
We did want to point out a couple highlights from that live show, and one is here. Do you notice anything special about this particular sort of shot that we've grabbed?
Yep.
Let me zoom in so that everybody can see. If you see right here, that is Jim Nakashima
photobombing us
during our time. He stood there for it seems like several minutes just so that he could get his face sort of in the middle of this. So. Right between me and Brian, there's Jim Nakashima, which actually brings us to the second thing that may surprise people about this.
I know.
Is look at this right here, separated by only inches.
I know. It was actually we had to agree beforehand that there would be no cage style throwdowns.
Yeah, there was actually we both signed contracts.
Yeah.
But we reconciled our differences. No longer, I think, is Brian Keller enemy of the Cloud Cover Show.
Not as big, at least.
And he didn't quite apologize in the same way. It may be that I'm still considered an enemy of the of This Week in Channel 9. I don't know. we'll leave that up to him. But it is kind of surprising that we're here. Now, something else that we wanted to point out about Brian Keller, now that he's a friend of the show, we actually want to talk about some of the nice things that he does. And one of those things that he does is, somebody actually has to get into that Channel 9 guy suit every day and be the mascot for Channel 9. And you might not be able to see it, but if I sort of point out, just imagine, here's Brian's head. He gets into that Channel 9 suit, kind of looks like this. He's got these little arms.
Yeah. It seems like it was a natural.
He's got his little headset thing there. Those like funny hairdo thingies that he's got on the top. That's actually Brian Keller. When you see the Channel 9 guy,
it was based off of. We actually had an artist come in and they interviewed a few folks to act as the model for the Channel 9 guy, and they said, well, this kind of looks like Brian, so we took it from there.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've gotten enough out of this particular picture. So let's move to the next one. The next one, this was a feature that this was actually part of. This is not some outtake. This is part of the live broadcast that we did.
We want to point out here.
Should I give you drawing capabilities?
Drawing capabilities. We want to point out here that this area is meant to display phones.
Yeah.
And what we have is a touch capable. Unit right here. We got the glasses. It looks like we have a hearing device in here. There's some audio capabilities right in this area.
Yep.
So it's it's actually an advanced feature of this.
And this
phone.
is actually, if you see, this is a 3D camera that we've got here because there are two lenses actually. They can take 3D pictures. So this is one of the new phones. The people at PDC had a choice of phone. They could either get that Samsung or they get the LG or they could get this one. No one shows this one.
Yeah, it's shocking.
But we showed it on our.
we wanted to make best use of all the cameras that we had, and this was the best way we could figure out. No one else put their face in the camera hole. Come on.
Yeah, so we did that. Okay, so let's
go to the feature.
Let's get that off the screen. Let's talk about our feature for this week, which is startup tasks in web and worker roles in Windows Azure. And we should say up front, before anybody gets confused, that this is a feature that is coming. This is part of the new, what's going to be SDK 1.3 when it releases. It's not out there yet, so you cannot go do what we're going to do in this show, unless, of course, you're watching the show later this year, in which case you're going to already have it. So
we should also caveat saying, while we don't anticipate big changes in what we show and how it's delivered, there could be some slight changes. They might change the syntax in some cases based on usability. We're getting to the point where it's probably not going to change, but there's always a slight
We're close
chance.
enough, but exactly. We're showing some pre-release bits. In fact, these aren't even sort of latest build. I've got an SDK that's actually now more than a month old.
Yeah.
Maybe even more. So this is a little bit behind, so hopefully everything looks about the same. I don't anticipate it changing in major ways, but if you're watching this later and you're going through this and something doesn't auto-complete in the right place or something seems missing, go find an actual current blog post or something about how to use this and see, because it might be that things have changed. So with that, what are startup tasks?
I'm glad you asked.
Good. Well, then go ahead and answer.
Well, the easiest thing is to say I would categorize them as a way to bootstrap your role.
Yeah.
So these are where you put short installation scripts, and I want to say short as intentionally, not hour-long installs, but do short tasks. So you could be running installer, you could be updating registry keys, you could be tweaking config settings, you could be scripting or running bat files, but we want them to be short and repeatable.
Yeah.
And we'll get into more on that as well. But the big deal about these is you have a choice to run these as an administrator. And when you do that, obviously you pretty much can do whatever you want as an admin. At that point, that allows you to elevate, do a quick install, and then your role drops back down to the normal kind of user mode kind of code, which is just a best practice to do anyways. Now, we'll probably cover it in here as well, but there is a scenario where you can run your role elevated the entire time.
Yep.
I don't really recommend it. Most people don't need that. It turns out, like,
usually
95% of the people never need to use that full-time elevation. They just really need to bootstrap the role. It's installing a COM component, like I said, tweaking the registry or setting up, doing some config setting changes. So that's really what these startup tests are about.
So let's go to the demo that I have. This is actually running in the cloud. and it's
That is a great UI. Did you spend a lot of time on the Ajax?
Again, are we gonna every time I show one of these things, we're gonna do this? Yes, I spent a lot of time working on the UI for this.
Well, I see you're a classic ASP developer.
Yes. So that's what we're going to use Startup Task to do here. It's come up more times than I'm really comfortable with. People have asked sort of, how do I get a classic ASP site running in Windows Azure? And the answer for a long time has been, well, you really can't, because classic ASP isn't actually installed by default in sort of a server install, and that means it's not installed in Windows Azure VMs in the cloud. Right. So when you go run your web role, the classic ASP just isn't there. The engine to execute this isn't there. People have thought that what they're waiting for is for VM role, which is one of the other features that came out, and then they can make their own VM where they've installed all the stuff that they want. They can package it up in a VHD, ship it up to the cloud, and run it. You could do that if you wanted to, but we're going to show how.
That's like a sledgehammer.
We're going to show how with
to kill a mosquito.
3 lines of XML and 1 line of a batch file. Yep. You can just use a regular web role, but with a startup task, get classic ASP running. So instead of using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito, we're going to use a couple lines of code. All right, so here's the actual page. Here's the excellent UI I spent a lot of time on.
I almost forget actually how to do that.
This is what I had
code anymore.
I went to Bing and I typed in "Hello World Classic ASP" to find how to do it.
And I think I cut my teeth on it in 1998 or something like that on classic
ASP. Yeah.
So it's been a while.
It looks a lot like ASP.NET does, because obviously that's sort of
it looks just like MVC
evolution
now. So
yeah, exactly. ASP.NET MVC is actually just classic ASP.
Isn't this the Razor syntax?
Yes.
Keep going.
No, it's not. So here we have a response.write with like a lowercase w, because I thought that's cool. That's more classic ASP. I think you can do it either way.
It's completely case insensitive.
But I think it doesn't matter. So anyway, so here's response.write. Hello from classic ASP. That's the code that's running. It's a .asp file.
And I noticed some of the other hallmarks, which is there's no error handling in here at all, which was a common thing to do with classic ASP. Is just
and you know what's been killing me every time I try to run this is I press F5 and it goes, I can't debug this. You don't have a web config that has this set up. It's kind of been a little bit fun. Here's actually all the code for, speaking of no web config. There's no web.config over here. Yeah. There's a webrole.cs, but I'm not actually doing anything in it, so you could delete that if you wanted to. Yep. People should know by now probably that in a web role you do have an entry point like that, but you actually don't have to implement anything there if you don't want to. So I just left it. It
used to be that the reason that was there was you could start the diagnostics in there. We'll get to that. Why you don't even need that anymore.
Oh yeah, that's
a whole other show. So
don't even open that. Okay, so anyway, so how did this actually? Why does this work? If you just went and did this in a web role, it would just fail miserably. Why does this work? It's because of a startup task.
Let's bump up the font. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, I got it. We're gonna full screen it and everything. This is it. This is you may not recognize this. This is for full IIS purposes. We will definitely be covering that in another show.
You left off an option.
What did I leave off? I left off the
type.
Yeah, because I went with the default. Should we put the task type in?
Let's put the task type so we can.
Task type equals simple. That's the default. Okay, but now we've got sort of the full range of options. So you can put this startup. This works on either web roles or worker roles. In this case, I'm doing it with a web role. But you can put this startup element in there, and then you can put as many tasks in here as you want. Is there any limit? Well, before I say as many as you want, I wonder if there's some limit.
I think it's really gated by, we're going to think you're unhealthy if you don't eventually get out of startup within a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah.
And I don't actually know what the final setting is going to be, if it's 5 minutes, if it's an hour, something like that. But you might get role unresponsive kind of behavior
if you just never come back.
If you have a startup task that's like,
that makes sense.
Sleep, for 2 hours.
Right. That's actually what this batch file does. It just sleeps for 2 hours. So what's in a task? There's a command line. This has to be relative to your. We'll show where the code goes, but this has to be something that's actually in your project
or in your path. Yeah.
So, but you can't call out. What I tried to do originally was sort of directly put the command line I wanted to run in here. It didn't work because there actually has to be. We will try to invoke this actual file. It won't go sort of, if it's a built-in command or whatever. This is not sort of anything you could type from the command line, and we'll talk about some other restrictions on kind of what it does. But But this is basically a file that's in your project. We'll show that file in a second. Here is where we decide whether we want to run this elevated or not. So the two options are elevated or limited. Elevated means it runs as admin.
I'm sure there's a scenario for running it as limited, but really if you're doing these startup tasks, you're probably going to want it as an admin, which is kind of the purpose of it.
If you're running as limited as a startup task, you could just put that code in like on start in webrole.cs or workerrole.cs, and you could just put it there, and it would be pretty much the same thing. And so I agree. I think that the common case is that people are going to do this elevated. There are possible reasons.
I wonder what the default is if you took it out.
The default is limited. I'm pretty sure the default is limited. So you do need to specify, because you don't want to accidentally run as admin when you didn't mean to. I think that's why the default. I think elevated is a reasonable default, except that we want to make sure people don't do it by mistake. So this just says run as admin, and then this, as Ryan pointed out, there are a few options here. Simple is sort of the default, and simple says, and simple is usually what you're going to want. Simple says run this task, don't do anything else until it's done.
Block on it.
Once it's done, move on to the next thing, right?
Exactly.
And go on.
So if you had multiple tasks, it would start the first one, then it would go to the next one, then the next one. It wouldn't launch them simultaneously. It'd wait for the output of one. So this is the case where if you had an installer that had to install something first, then the next task had to configure it, you have to use simple. Otherwise, you just have a race condition where the second task could try to configure something that hasn't been installed yet.
And I'm using simple here because if I didn't do this, this task is what's installing the ASP support in IIS.
Yeah.
So if I didn't put simple on here, then it would start, and then my webrole would start up, and it would say ready and whatever, and I went and browsed to it, it wouldn't work. And then it would probably start working later because the task would actually finish and it would install. But this way, I don't actually start, the webrole isn't started and ready until this task completes. And so you almost always want to do simple. The other two options are foreground and background. By the way, these names could possibly change between now and when this ships, so if there's something different, the concepts will probably be the same, the name might change.
Yeah, there will be probably three options, but the names
and
might
they'll probably
change.
mean these things, but foreground and background are like threads. That's the way. Foreground and background sounded confusing to me until someone said, oh no, it's like threads in your C# code or something, where a foreground thread means we don't exit the process until that thread's done. So that thread is, it's foreground in that it's sort of considered to be part of that process. We can't actually execute or exit until it's done. And background task is the opposite, which is, well, we start that thread off, but we can just
it's long running. It's long running. It has nothing to do with this code.
It's going to do its thing, and who cares, right? So that's what it means here. So foreground task means that we won't actually exit until that task is done. So you consider that kind of part of your role.
So if you had a long running process that needed to survive, let's say you wanted to launch a process that ran forever in the webrole, you'd actually choose background.
Yeah, and it would just keep running.
It would keep running. It doesn't matter if your role entry point was recycled or anything. At that point, it spun off into its own process, its own stack and everything, and you're done.
Right, and a foreground task, on the other hand, would have to be killed with it. It has to die with the role.
When the role goes down, then your
then that also
goes
has
down.
to
Exactly.
Right. So those are the options. It's actually pretty straightforward, especially if you're almost always using simple, which is what I've done so far. You just have what is the command line you want to run, and do you want to run it elevated or not? And let's go look at what startup.cmd is. That's it.
Start with package manager.
Yep. Start with, that's what the /w means, right? With.
Start wait for.
Yeah,
package.
the /w actually means why don't you go get a coffee, because I'm not going to return until this thing is done. No, it means wait. This is our way of making sure, because package manager just returns, if you tried running this on the command line, you'll see it just sort of drops right back to the command line because it's like a Windows executable. So then it does work for a while. Start /w says go do that, but don't come back until that process is actually exited, right? So this basically says block, that goes with sort of our simple task. Block on package manager until it's done installing IIS-ASP. By the way, this takes next to no time. I was sort of surprised with how fast this returns. this is a really quick one.
Well, it's only one, if I recall correctly now, it's been a while, it's only one ASP module that gets registered.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's just registering
done.
like one little...
It goes in and it says put the .asp extension to asp_asapi.dll, and then you're done.
I think it also updates the default documents. I noticed in here, I don't have a web config, I didn't set the default document, but default.asp worked.
Oh, okay.
So I think it does that too, but yeah, it's exactly, it's like, it's very minimal kind of config that it does and whatever. And so you can install other stuff this way. Ryan and I had a thread about whether we should be showing package manager or OC setup or server manager. Like, there are a lot of different ways that you can configure these things. I think they all fall down, in the case of ASP, I think they all fall down to package manager.
Yes.
So I think they're all equivalent for this specific one, but if you're installing some other component or whatever, find that, the way I found this is I searched on Bing for command line to install ASP, and it just came up.
If you look for the right
way
if you actually do a search for OC setup in MSDN, it will give you a list of all of the special words that are there for, you know, ASP is one of them, but there's a billion features in Windows and a billion roles. So the thing that's kind of can get confusing is a role, like you want to do a file server or, you know, a web server. If you say OC setup web server, it'll go and just install automatically the default stuff for the web server. If you go ahead and say start OC setup IIS-ASP, it just installs that feature. Now, it's smart enough, though, if you have dependencies, like say you did this and you, for whatever reason, you were in a worker role. It would actually go, oh, you don't have iNet installed. You don't even have the web server. Oh, let me go install that for you. And it would actually bootstrap that entire role, which can take a while. So you kind of do want to know what's going to happen on here. But it's a great trick to know.
And that's about it. You know, one thing I think we should point out about startup tasks, as you're authoring this thing, right? Like here I just have, install IIS-ASP. What happens if it's already installed? Because this will actually come up if your role recycles, the startup task will run again, but you may actually be in the same VM that already has this installed because you already did it.
High likelihood.
Idempotent is the word again. We love this word on the show, and we talk about it when we talk about queues, but it's the same thing for startup tasks. They need to be able to run multiple times without something bad happening. So one thing that you might do is you might check here. You might have some test, like, did I already run? You know, you might set something, or you might know what the VM looks like after this has run successfully, and you might just skip doing it. In the case of Package Manager, if it's already installed, it just comes back, right? So here, this one is safe. You can use this line of code, but as you're designing your startup task, test running it multiple times. Now, fortunately, you're going to test on your local machine probably, and every time you run, you're going to rerun this stuff. So you're going to actually get to see this probably in testing. You're going to run this multiple times. It's actually a bit hard to test this fully in the dev fabric, because once you've done the command and it's worked, if you then make tweaks, you sort of have to make sure you undo it, that you uninstall whatever it was, or that you somehow get back to the state that you start in. It's probably best to make sure you really do test this well in the cloud, because that's the time when you're on a complete new VM that is sort of in its sort of original state, and you can really test what happens. And so. So I don't know. That's kind of that's one of the big things to keep in mind. Startup tasks can do a lot of stuff.
I was bit by this actually. I was installing something that was more driver related. I won't say what it is yet, but I was installing something that was more driver related, and it was not repeatable. Like the first time, it ran perfectly, and then you ran it again. I don't know what happened. It would just blow up. The role would go unresponsive and all sorts of stuff. So I ended up having to go and find the registry key that indicated whether or not this thing was installed. And then I have to wrap it in a bat script that said, reg query this path. If you see this value, it means it's installed.
Right.
If error level equals 1, it means it's not installed. Go ahead and install it. So there are ways to detect it. You're going to have to figure that out. If you have any experience scripting in a bat file environment, or you could even launch PowerShell from here and have a kind of more robust scripting environment. But you will have to. You
can write a C# executable and we tend to use batch files, but I mean, if it's okay if the logic is sort of complicated, right? But you can write any code you want.
That's actually what I did.
You need something to execute. Yeah, so you ended up with the batch file was unwieldy.
What I wanted to do was download a semi-large package, and I didn't want to have to ship it with my with the service package every time. So I put it in blob
code that
storage,
actually downloads
and then
it from
and then I
blobs.
actually wrote code that downloaded from blob storage, put it in the right location, got the right path, and then launched process.start, this whole thing, and actually perform the installation. So you can do that. It's an easy way to do it.
Yeah. Now, one thing, if you're doing detection logic, like if you're going, oh, well, if it's already installed, then don't do it. One thing to be careful about is, what if you fail during installation?
Yep.
But your detection code says, oh, it's already been done.
Yep.
You won't ever get to retry it, and so you'll sort of be in this stuck state where the VM's not actually ready to run your stuff, but your startup task is going, oh, it looks good, and just exiting, which means you'll go on and try to run your code and it won't work. So that's another thing to be careful about, is that whatever detection logic you're doing in there, you're detecting something that really does indicate that it's done and succeeded.
Yeah. When I was troubleshooting, I actually that a C# class that I created that actually ran the installation. I actually had a whole bunch of try catches around every possible condition, and if anything happened during the installation, I was doing a quick and dirty debug on it. So I would just take the output of the exception and drop it into a file in blob storage that says, install fail.blob or whatever, and just upload the text. So I could see the stack trace that was like, this is already installed, this didn't have permission, or whatever it was. So it works fine. You'll figure out that once you're an admin on the box. I mean, there's just so many different ways you can tackle the same problem.
Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of it. I think we should probably move on to our tip of the week, which is related to startup tasks and kind of how they run. That means we need an intro for the tip of the week.
And we've been talking about startup tasks. So I'm wondering if Bob can do anything with the Windows 95 theme.
Okay. All right. So with that, here is your tip of the week.
Start me up, start me, start me up, start me, start me, start me up, start me. That's what I'm talking about.
Great.
All right.
So this one is one that Ryan pointed out to me, because I've played with startup tasks a lot less than Ryan has so far, and I did not know this. And
it makes perfect sense though if you think about it.
Okay.
Well, so
why does it make perfect sense? Because it just seems to me. Go ahead. Let's tell them what it is.
So the tip of the week is startup tasks run a system.
Yes.
Okay. So that, if you think about it, that kind of almost has to be the case, because these are instances running in the cloud. There are no users. There are no users in the cloud. We're not like we're going out and creating users.
But there's some user that the rest of my code runs as, right? I thought we generate some user.
It's a completely injected SID. Like they just make up a SID. There's no user.
So there's no actual user.
If you go look in fact, when you have the features here, if you go RDP into a running instance, you will find no users except for the person that we had to create for you to RDP.
in. So that's the only user.
That's the only user,
okay.
And that only happens if you enable RDP.
Okay.
So these roles, when they start up, like I said, there is this 0 users. Therefore, if you need an admin, you're either going to have to do one of two things. You have to go create a user and then run the code as that user, which is an admin, or you just run a system.
Right.
And system is an easier thing to do, obviously, and it's all powerful. I mean, system is all powerful on the machine. You can do all sorts of fun stuff there. It runs a system. Now, the catch, and why this is the tip of the week, is a lot of installers that you guys might have, they think about running as a user profile. That there is some user profile, that they're going to put it in the default user profile, they're going to put something in whatever it is, or they just expect that to be there. That's not going to happen here. If your installer has to run under a user, and you have that, like that's just the way it is, what you're going to have to do is actually, in your startup script create a user, and then use the all-powerful run as that user, then call the installer. So you can still work around it. Remember, your system, you can do anything you want, including creating lots and lots of users in a cloud VM that you have absolute control over. So that's the tip, that's the caveat, that's the gotcha. If you want to make sure that your system or your installer or whatever it is you're running in the cloud runs, I would try to launch it as system locally.
Yeah, right. That's so
which
you
actually
can
doesn't
actually
have
test the-
that. Unfortunately, the startup tests do not run. If I remember correctly, on my local machine, they do not run as system.
They probably just run as you had to start Visual Studio as admin and whatever,
Yeah.
and when you run this, it probably just runs as your
Exactly.
user.
It runs as
in
you,
an
so
admin
so you won't catch this. And it's
Interesting.
very, very subtle until things don't work, and you're like, why is that? And then you look, and you're like, oh, well, there's absolutely no user profile. That's why.
Somehow I see Ryan spending dozens of
saving-
hours
yeah.
debugging this thing.
I'm
So-
saving you a lot of trouble.
Good. So let's take that to heart. Okay, so that's a good tip. So basically the tip is, because the things run a system, it's probably a good idea to check your code, to try running your code as system on the local box, just to grab any of those issues early. It's much easier to find them when you're running locally.
Exactly.
And even so, that means if I RDP, if I go and use the new remote desktop feature, which is also coming later this year, and go connect to my Windows Azure VM and try to run the installer, there it might work fine because I am a user because we create a user so that I can connect.
Yep.
So
This is a really tough one
so
to
this
catch.
is one that could easily trip you up. So it's something good to keep in mind. That I think that's a great tip.
All right.
Okay, so I think that takes us to the end of the show.
Yep.
Next week, Ryan is going to be in Europe for Tech Ed Europe.
That is correct.
I'm not.
I'm going to be carrying a couple of folks' bags, I believe. They've actually just hired me as a luggage porter. So I'll be in Europe. If you're in Europe and you want to connect, help me carry the luggage or anything like that, send me a tweet. I will be there. I'll be at Tech Ed Monday through Wednesday. So if you're there and you want to talk, want to chat, you want to get on Cloud Cover Live, or you have ideas for the show, look me up.
Cloud Cover Live? Is there going to be Cloud Cover Live from Tech Ed? Are you going to do a Cloud Cover Live?
I should. No.
We should do 2 cloud covers at the same time. You should do one in Europe.
And then we splice them together.
We should video conference. Okay, so I don't know what's going to happen next week for a cloud cover, because I'm actually going to be around, and there's like a ton of stuff to cover. So I might be able to find somebody else to kind of come in, and I'll call that person Ryan, and we'll just pretend.
I'm sure that you should find someone named Ryan on campus.
Oh, let's just find a Ryan.
Just
a random
Ryan. It'd be like, hey.
So we might do that. We might not. We might not have a show next week. If you want to have a show next week, send a bunch of tweets, because then we feel like you actually care.
But keep in mind, a lot of the people we might want to talk to might also be at Tech Ed. So I know
it's actually been kind of.
I know there's
here.
been some requests for things like SQL Azure, and we're definitely going to cover that.
Yep.
Don't get me wrong. It's just that some of the key people we want to talk to are going to be at Tech Ed Europe.
All the important people are going to be at Tech Ed.
Except for
Steve. I don't
Steve.
know why I wasn't invited.
I think you were, and I think you said, I'm not going to Europe.
It is possible I was invited and declined. So we might be able to pull something together for next week. Otherwise, we'll take that week off, and then we'll come back when Ryan gets back from Europe, and we'll do another show and cover some more of the new features.
So much to cover.
They're coming.
So little time.
If you have ideas about what I should maybe do without Ryan next week, or if you have any other suggestions, always send your tweets to @CloudCoverShow on Twitter. We read those religiously.
Yep. All right. Thanks.
Till next time. Bye.